But I've always believed, and I said this to some nice lady with the newspaper here who called me up the other day. She said, well, why are you coming there to Illinois to talk about James Jones? And I told her, I said, because he is a towering figure in American literature, not just Second World War literature, but in American literature. And I mean that, I'm not going to go through the litany of names that you could compare Jim with, they with Jim, but he certainly was a towering figure in World War II literature. I mean, he defined an entire generation that no other World War II writer did, and I knew most of them, because Cayley did too. There weren't but about 4 or 5 of the really good ones. There's Norman Mailer, and he's still alive, and Irwin with the Young Lions, and Kurt Vonnegut, and Joe Heller, and that was about it. Jim, but Jim didn't just stop write one book. He went on and wrote the whole trilogy, and I would certainly add Some Came Running into that, because it was almost the best years of your lives add-on. It wasn't designed for that, but that generation was such, and I remember it as a child, sitting at a Sunday afternoon dinner when all the talk of the older folks was something happened before the war, during the war, or after the war. Everything was defined that way. And Jim was to that, like Fitzgerald, Hemingway was to the 20s, or John O'Hara was to the 30s, the Depression. He was the spokesman for that whole war generation. And he dominated the subject. Now, I sort of said I wasn't going to get into this tonight, but we were driving down here with half the English department of this college. And we were talking about postmodernism, which I think some people call deconstruction, which I personally think is the biggest pile of shit I've ever... I mean, there's a way to do it, but you know, when you start dividing things up into, first of all, assessing a writer's work by that writer's politics, and then whether that writer is politically correct by the mores and standards today, as opposed to his mores and standards maybe 30, 40 years ago, or even 200 years ago, is not just silly. I mean, it's a great historical fallacy, and I don't know or even believe that anybody, I have no reason to suspect that anybody has been doing that with Jim, but if any of y'all heard that they have, let me know, and I'll see what I can do about it. But, you know, on the other hand, when you look at the body of his work, one thing that impressed me more about Jim than anything else, having read his novels first in college or shortly after and then later, is his total control and mastery of his characters. And you don't find that often. I mean, especially when you've got so many characters as you did in The Thin Red Line. I mean, you know, you look at the Red Badge of Courage, he had one character. Hell, Jim had he had a dozen in The Thin Red Line. He had control over every single one of them. Every single one of them was interesting. And that's hard to do. It takes an enormously analytical mind and a certain kind of genius to be able to make more puppets and you got 10 fingers dance to your tune all at the same time. And he got a bad rap, I think, by a lot of critics, and some of it was fair enough, and some of his work, I think, that he needed some editing, which was, I think, the polite way they put it these days. But some of his stuff ran on too long, and some came running, but I'd put that book up against practically anything else of that period that I can think of. I think Jim's problem there was, as he said himself, he he didn't go to college, and he cut his teeth on Thomas Wolfe. Well, now, I mean, that man, he'd go on now. I guarantee he run off at the mouth. And then if you leave Thomas Wolfe and go to Faulkner, you didn't know, I mean, half these people, they didn't know themselves what the sentence was by the time they got through with it 2 or 3 pages later. And so he had to overcome a lot of handicaps that he brought on himself by reading those guys first instead of Hemingway. But maybe he didn't like Hemingway, I don't know. But I do, you know, one of my most cherished things that I have is after Jim died, I don't know, a year or so, Gloria began to parcel out little things to his friends, and I think she gave something to Adam, and all of us, and she gave me a pair of cufflinks. Jim was a great collector of things. He liked fine things. There's these knives and oh, I don't know what all. And so she gave me these cufflinks, which are the most garish. They are silver Mexican turquoise, big old turquoise silver Mexican thing. But I mean, if you look at them, you can see why he liked them. I like them too. I swear to you, I was going to bring them up here, and I couldn't find my shirt with the cuff thing in it where you could wear the double cuffs. But, you know, I look back on Jim with such fond memories, and what I think really is that the James Jones Society, of which some or many of you are members, and symposiums like this, and the fact that you guys will come out on a night to hear some Alabama shit kicker like me talk about Jim Jones is really heartwarming, because this is the kind of thing that I think is needed in American literature, where, you know, so many writers just pass away and they're kind of forgotten until somebody in academia or somewhere writes a big book about it, and then everybody else gets all excited. And I don't see anybody on the horizon writing about Jim, mainly because the subject that he was most famous for is politically incorrect in itself. I mean, I'd love to personally write a biography of Jim, but I was too close to him to do it. You need somebody who's more dispassionate than me. And there will be someone come along and do it, because I guarantee you he was good enough in what he did, in the corpus of his work. I think he'll stand up with the best of American writers over the long haul. So on that happy note, I don't know how much time we have, but I thank all of y'all for coming, and I would be glad to entertain a question or two if anybody has one. If you don't have any questions, I can ask myself questions. Or we can all go to some saloon and get drunk or whatever, and we don't have to fool with questions. Oh, we got a saloon over here. That's a good question. Did Jim's prose serve as a model for me? You know, yeah, in a way that in my first book, I think all first books are probably going to be imitated somehow, but you can't help it, because you don't know what you're doing. I mean, I was a true fool coming from the newspaper business and then trying to write a fairly serious novel. And so Jim's work was my model. Now, I could have modeled it on Hemingway and Hemingway's prose, but that wouldn't have made much sense. Hemingway didn't write about the same thing Jim did. I thought Jim did it better. But I don't think that the book itself was imitative at all. And I mean, but I stole from him where I could, yeah. That answers your question. Anybody else?